This is the Breaker.news podcast for the week of April 10th, 2022. I'm Bob Mackin, publisher of the Breaker.news and host of the Breaker.news podcast. Welcome to edition number 233. The Breaker is your source for news, opinion, and analysis about British Columbia issues, institutions, and influencers. Later, I'll tell you how you can support The Breaker. On this edition, headlines from the Pacific Rim and the Pacific Northwest. The Is It Just Me commentary. I award a virtual Nanaimo bar to a difference maker. And the big deal feature. World Parkinson's Day is April 11th. More than 3 years ago, the BC NDP government promised it would make a life-changing surgery available to more people in BC, but nothing has happened. Hear from Michael Harling, a Vancouver sports writer, on why deep brain stimulation surgery would make a difference for him and many others living with the disease. But first, is it just me? Is it just me, or are you thankful for the Victoria Police for preventing an anti-vaccine truck blockade around the legislature? And are you thankful for the Vancouver Police for quickly removing Save Old Growth protesters from the Lionsgate Bridge? Canadians have the right to protest. Canadians have the right to disagree with government. But there are reasonable limits. There's a time and place for everything. Streets, bridges, border crossings, they need to be kept clear for many reasons, including public transit and emergency vehicles. Working class people need to get to work, and ambulance drivers need to get people to hospital fast. The Save Old Growth protesters spent much of last week targeting North Shore drivers on the Lionsgate and Second Narrows bridges, and then on the Upper Levels Highway, in both directions. Yes, they temporarily strangled one of only two east-west roadways on the North Shore. Meanwhile, above the highway, forests are disappearing, and nobody is around to stop the trees from being cut down in the name of more luxury housing. I would suggest a certain group of people could do the job. We could ask them for help, but I think they're just too damn busy gluing their hands to pavement. What do you think? Email Bob at theBreaker.news. This is the Big Deal feature on the Breaker.news podcast. World Parkinson's Day is April 11th. The degenerative disease causes a loss of control of movements, body, and emotions. Scientists continue to search for a cure, but a deep brain stimulation implant can treat those symptoms and vastly improve the quality of life. It's like a pacemaker, but for the brain. On February 5th, 2019, BC NDP Health Minister Adrian Dix said that help was coming. There would be more access to deep brain stimulation surgery for those with serious symptoms. But more than 3 years later, the Adrian Dix action plan from 2019 is just a plan, and there's no action. BC has not hired a second doctor to perform the surgery, and the wait list is measured in years. In other provinces, it's measured in months. Joining me on the Breaker.news podcast is my guest, Michael Harling, a Vancouver writer who has contributed to the Georgia Straight, Vancouver Courier, and Global Mail, author of rock and roll trivia and books about Jaromir Jagr and Peter Forsberg. He's also co-creator of HonkyTonkGirl.ca, which reveals country music legend Loretta Lynn's life in South Vancouver. Michael Harling is one of many British Columbians waiting for this life-changing surgery. Michael, welcome to the Breaker.news podcast. First, I want to ask you, when and how did Parkinson's change your life?
Hey, Bob. It was about 25 years ago. When I was 37. I received a diagnosis of Parkinson's, and it confirmed about 5 years of casual observations that I'd made that I was not functioning properly. It's meant I've changed my life considerably. I'm no longer able to work, and I spend an inordinate amount of time doing routine tasks that able-bodied people don't give a second thought to. It takes me 2 or 3 times longer to do almost everything.
How could deep brain stimulation change your life?
when you get that surgery? How will it change your life?
Well, it's not altogether clear that I will get the surgery. But if I were to have it, it would arrest the progression of my symptoms and allow me to function in a more typical fashion. And it would give me back large chunks of my life.
Back in February 2019, you and a lot of British Columbians who live with Parkinson's, there's about 15,000 people in British Columbia with Parkinson's. This gave people a lot of hope that Health Minister Adrian Dix was coming forward with this action plan to increase access to deep brain stimulation. I mean, Dr. Christopher Honey is the main surgeon who performs this procedure. And here we are 3 years later, even though we have had the pandemic getting in the way, the government has got a lot of surgeries on track and has added a lot of other programs not pandemic related. You recently met with your MLA, David Eby, who is the Attorney General, and he's the Housing Minister. How did that meeting go? What did you say to David Eby, and what did he say to you about what next?
I told David Eby that we had a problem with the health minister and his ministry refusing to acknowledge this promise he'd made over 3 years ago. And Mr. Eby was quite compassionate and empathetic. And he said he'd speak to Adrian if there are seatmates in the legislature. And he jokingly said he'd poke Adrian in the ribs and get him to the table and bring his checkbook. And he made all the promises that politicians are famous for making. And he said he'd like to have a favorable outcome by the 1st of April. And it turned out to be an April Fool's joke, because no one has come to the table with a checkbook.
Now, we found out that the BC NDP politicians have found ways to give themselves raises, retroactive raises to last year. But there's a lot of people in British Columbia that need help in a lot of ways, including people with Parkinson's. This is Parkinson's Month. April 11th is World Parkinson's Day. What does this say to you about the government not moving fast enough to fulfill this promise, especially when Dr. Christopher Honey, the expert in deep brain stimulation in BC, is ready to go? He said that he could start more surgeries as of July 1st this year, but the problem is funding. The funding's not in place. The funding's not in place from the government, a government which has found ways to give themselves pay raises. What does that make you feel? What kind of message does that send to people in need like you?
Well, I think it says we're not very important. I like to remind them of Michael Wilson, who is Brian Mulroney's finance minister. In 1988, he tried to fiddle with the old age pension. And there's a problem when you fiddle with the old age pension. Old age people, they have a lot of time to sit around and plot against you. And I think Mr. Dix is going to see the concerted effort by us old shaky people to have him account for his ministry in action.
If Adrian Dix is listening to this, if anyone that works with Adrian Dix is listening to this, what is your message to Adrian Dix? What is your message to the people around Adrian Dix who can deliver him a message? What do they need to know? What is your message to them right now?
Oh, first of all, I'd like to thank Adrian Dix for his service to the community of British Columbia gave it all, and I shall be very grateful for that. But that doesn't exclude his obligation to live up to his commitments, to honor his word, and to be fair to people with Parkinson's and give them what he promised.
Thank you for joining us on the Breaker.news podcast, Michael Harling, for telling us your story and telling us why this is so important that the NDP fulfills the promise to make this happen, to make a difference in lives of people like you.
Thank you very much, Bob. It's been a privilege.
That was my guest, Michael Harling, one of the 15,000 people in BC living with Parkinson's disease. I invited Health Minister Adrian Dix to appear on this podcast to answer some of my questions, but he did not respond. Now it's time on the Breaker.news podcast for Around the Rim. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Rim. In the Taiwan news, Taiwan population declines to 23.26 million. Births increased in March, but still outnumbered by deaths. Taiwan's population declined by 1.09%, or 257,000. March saw the birth of almost 13,000 babies, an increase of more than 3,000 from February. Nevertheless, more than 18,000 people died during March 2022, meaning deaths still outnumbered births in Taiwan. In the Hong Kong Free Press, Hong Kong government fines 6 people over COVID-19 violations in birthday party scandal. Over 200 people, including senior officials, attended the event just as the Omicron variant was beginning to spread. News about the party broke after 2 guests tested positive for COVID-19, and over 170 were later sent to compulsory quarantine, including Police Chief Raymond Shui, Immigration Chief Ka Wang, Home Affairs Secretary Casper Shui, and Secretary for Financial Services and the Treasury Christopher Hui. In Kyoto news, Japan to expel Russian diplomats in concerted effort with allies. The Japanese government said Friday it will expel 8 Russians, including diplomats, in a concerted effort with the United States and European countries, strongly condemning Moscow's killing of many innocent civilians in Ukraine. Even as Russia is likely to take countermeasures, such as sending Japanese diplomats there back home, Japan will take all possible measures to protect activities of Japanese nationals and businesses in Russia, the Prime Minister said at a press conference. That's Around the Rim on this edition of the Breaker.news podcast. Now it's time on the Breaker.news podcast for Cascadia Calling. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Northwest. In the Oregonian, Portland's World Naked Bike Ride is back this summer. It will take place on the evening of July 30th. So far, that's the extent of the details. The World Naked Bike Ride is just one of many themed rides planned every summer as part of Portland's Pedalpalooza. The summer of 2022 is already chock full of these rides, starting June 1st and ending August 31st. They include Mr. World Ride, a Pitbull-themed ride, and the Dead Freeways Ride, a tour of Portland's forgotten or never-built freeways. In the Seattle Times, Seattle continues to go backward on crime as much as 30 years back. Crime in Seattle abruptly surged 20% to 721 crimes per 100,000 people, the highest since 2001 according to FBI records. The first 3 months of this year have been even more of a throwback. Aggravated assaults are up another 33% in the first quarter of 2022, robberies are up 30%, overall violent crime is up 32%. Crime ebbs and flows, but if it keeps flowing at this pace, the city would approach a violent crime rate of 900 per 100,000 people, a level of violence last seen in 1995. In the Victoria Times Colonist, head of pickleball group predicts conflicts as players move to Victoria's Central Park. Noise complaints have prompted an end to pickleball playing at James Bay's Todd Park. The city of Victoria has undertaken to shift more than 1,000 hours of pickleball bookings from Todd Park to Central after people living near the James Bay Park complained about noise. City of Victoria spokesman Bill Eisenhower said 6 of the 7 Todd Park pickleball groups have already made the transition to Central. That's Cascadia calling on this edition of the Breaker.news podcast.
And it don't matter what color you are, 'cause love will conquer hate, so you won't stand alone, you won't stand alone.
The virtual Nanaimo Bar, brought to you by Spruce Hill Contracting. Every week we end the Breaker.news podcast on a tasty note by awarding the goodness of a virtual Nanaimo Bar to people making a difference. A virtual version of the province's favorite dessert bar goes this week to Emergency Services Dispatchers, the people who answer the phone when British Columbians need police, fire, or ambulance. You can nominate someone for a virtual Nanaimo Bar. Send me an email to bob@theBreaker.news. Spruce Hill Contracting, custom homes and renovations. Find more information at sprucehill.ca.
Show me bracia,
That's it for the Breaker.news podcast for the week of April 10th, 2022. I'm Bob Mackin. Thanks for joining me. Did you know that on the 10th of April in 1998, the Good Friday Agreement was signed to end the Troubles in Northern Ireland? Now you know. Send me your feedback. Send me your story ideas to bob@theBreaker.news. Bookmark theBreaker.news. You can also find us at theBreaker.ca. Sign up for the email newsletter and get updates to your inbox. For news as it happens, follow The Breaker News on Twitter and visit theBreaker.news on Facebook. You can support The Breaker for as little as $2 a month. For more information, go to patreon.com/thebreakernews. That's patreon.com/thebreakernews. Until next week.